The first spark wasn't a fire. It wasn't even a wheel. It was a question, uttered not with words, but with wonder. A question that flickered in the mind of a primitive hominin staring at the stars. What if? What if there's more beyond this forest, beyond this hunt, beyond this cold night? That question didn't just lead to survival. It led to civilization. Long before pyramids touched the sky or kings claimed thrones, humanity teetered on the edge of extinction. We were fewer than 10,000 individuals on the entire planet, more endangered than pandas are today. And yet, somehow, we endured. Not because we were the strongest, not because we were the fastest, but because we could imagine. Around 12,000 years ago, as the last ice age gasped its final breath, nomadic bands of humans stumbled upon something revolutionary: seeds. Not for food that day, but for permanence. Near the banks of the Euphrates and the Tigris, where the soil was rich and the rivers generous, early humans began planting. The Fertile Crescent. That's what historians would one day call it. But to those first planters, it was simply survival made stationary. From this act, gathering seeds and staying put, everything else unfolded. Villages formed. Populations grew. Time, once only measured by sun and hunger, began to be counted in seasons, in harvests. And with more people came more problems. Property disputes, food distribution, leadership, in short, government. And where there is government, there is power. And where there is power, there is history. The Sumerians were among the first to write it down. Their wedge-shaped cuneiform impressions on clay weren't poems or stories at first. They were receipts, tax records, grain tallies. It was bureaucracy, not inspiration, that gave birth to writing. But make no mistake, those dull scribbles laid the groundwork for Shakespeare, for Newton, for every word you're hearing now. By 3000 BCE, the cities of Uruk and Ur were humming with life. They had temples, schools, ziggurats that scraped the clouds, or so it must have felt. They looked up at the same stars we do and wondered the same things. Who are we? Why are we here? Their answers came wrapped in myths. Gods who birthed rivers. Deities who demanded obedience and offerings. Religion was not an afterthought, it was architecture, economy, and law all rolled into one. But while Mesopotamia was busy inventing civilization, Egypt was building eternity. Along the Nile, a rhythm of life flourished with uncanny stability. The river rose, the crops grew, the people prospered. Then came the kings, pharaohs, declaring themselves gods on earth. They didn't just rule, they endured. We know their names even now: Djoser, Khufu, Ramses, carved into stone with obsessive permanence. The Great Pyramid of Giza was built over 4,500 years ago. Think about that. Cleopatra lived closer in time to us than to its construction. That's how old Egypt is. And yet, they mastered geometry, astronomy, and embalming techniques so advanced that modern science still hasn't cracked all their secrets. A civilization obsessed with death, and yet, ironically, one of the most immortal. Meanwhile, to the east, another ancient world was stirring. In the Indus Valley, modern-day Pakistan, and northwest India, a mysterious civilization was thriving. Cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa emerged with streets more orderly than some modern metropolises. They had running water, complex drainage systems, standardized weights and measures. But no grand monuments, no palaces, no kings carved in glory. They whispered their achievements rather than shouting them. And then they vanished, not with war, but with silence. Civilization was not a single march forward. It was a scattered ignition of brilliance across continents. In China, along the Yellow River, the Xia and Shang dynasties emerged. They too built cities, devised writing, worshipped ancestors, and waged wars. In Mesoamerica, the Olmec carved colossal heads from stone, leaving behind a culture that would later inspire the Maya and the Aztecs. But as much as humans created, they also destroyed. Around 1200 BCE, the Bronze Age collapsed like a house of cards. Across the Mediterranean, once great empires fell like dominoes. The Mycenaeans of Greece, the Hittites of Anatolia, the city of Ugarit, all gone. The cause? Still debated. Maybe sea raiders, maybe drought, maybe too much complexity too fast. But in their fall, the seeds of something new were planted, something that would redefine civilization once again. Out of the ruins rose the Greeks, not just warriors or sailors, but thinkers. For the first time, humans dared to believe that the universe might be knowable, that the gods were not the final answer, but the beginning of the question. Socrates asked, Plato dreamed, Aristotle analyzed, and from this trio of minds, Western philosophy was born. But ideas alone didn't shape history. Steel did. Alexander the Great, with Aristotle's lessons in one hand and a sword in the other, carved out an empire stretching from Greece to India before dying at 32. He left no heir, only chaos, and a cultural fusion that rippled for centuries. Rome, however, didn't rise in chaos. It rose in order slowly, steadily. What began as a republic evolved into an empire that ruled millions. Roman roads connected cities, Roman laws governed lives, Roman legions enforced it all. They borrowed gods from the Greeks, engineering from the Etruscans, and ambition from themselves. But no empire is eternal. When Rome fell, it wasn't from one strike but from 1,000 cuts. Corruption, invasion, overreach. Yet even in collapse, it passed the torch. To Byzantium, to the Islamic caliphates, to the fragmented kingdoms of medieval Europe. And just like that, the ancient world dimmed. But the story of human civilization was far from over. In fact, it was only beginning to write its most unpredictable chapters.
It begins not in a palace, but in a monastery. A flickering candle. A hunched monk. Ink slowly scratched onto parchment. In the ruins of the Roman Empire, it wasn't emperors who kept civilization alive, it was scribes. In dim candlelit rooms, monks copied scrolls they barely understood. Aristotle, Euclid, Galen, preserved in silence while outside, Europe unraveled. After Rome's fall in the West, the continent didn't descend into complete darkness, but it did forget how to read the stars. Roads crumbled. Cities shrank. Trade dried up. And yet, in this so-called Dark Age, another civilization was experiencing a golden dawn. While Europe turned inward, the Islamic world burst outward, brilliant, curious, hungry for knowledge. In Baghdad, a city that barely existed before the 8th century, scholars gathered in a place called the House of Wisdom. They translated Greek texts, expanded on Indian mathematics, and gave us algebra, algebra. They charted the heavens, refined medicine, mapped the known world. They didn't just inherit civilization, they rewrote it. At the same time, in the East, China was perfecting what the West hadn't even imagined yet. The Tang and Song dynasties witnessed a cultural and technological explosion. Paper money, the compass, gunpowder, the movable type printing press, centuries before Gutenberg would revolutionize Europe. China was the most advanced civilization on Earth, with cities like Kaifeng and Hangzhou outshining anything in Europe by orders of magnitude. But human progress is never linear. In the 13th century, a horseman thundered out of the Mongolian steppe, changing the fate of continents with every hoofbeat. Genghis Khan. A name that still echoes with both terror and awe. He didn't build monuments. He didn't write poetry. But he united the largest land empire in history, from the Pacific Ocean to the heart of Europe. And ironically, through destruction, he connected civilizations. The Silk Road, once perilous and patchy, became a superhighway of culture and commerce under Mongol rule. Paper traveled west. Mathematics traveled east. Black Death hitched a ride. Yes, the Black Death. Carried by fleas on rats, it arrived in Europe like an invisible army. Within years, a third of the population was dead. Entire villages vanished. Fields lay fallow. Priests, kings, peasants, death made no distinction. It was a catastrophe, but also a strange kind of reset. Laborers became valuable. Old hierarchies cracked. Ideas began to stir again. Then, from the ashes, came a rebirth. The Renaissance. It didn't start with Da Vinci's brush or Galileo's telescope, but in dusty libraries rediscovering lost knowledge. The printing press spread ideas like wildfire. Suddenly, a poor merchant's son in Florence could read Cicero, study Greek, question Aristotle. Art flourished. Science bloomed. The stars, once the domain of gods, became the playground of astronomers. And just as the universe was getting bigger, so too was the world. In 1492, Columbus sailed west in search of spice and found something far more valuable, an entire hemisphere. But let's not romanticize it. The age of exploration was also the age of conquest. The Aztec and Inca empires, rich, complex, and powerful, were decimated within decades. Not just by Spanish swords, but by smallpox, measles, and steel. Yet even amid conquest, exchange thrived. Crops from the Americas, maize, potatoes, tomatoes, transformed diets from Beijing to Berlin. Horses galloped through the New World. Silver poured into Spanish coffers. Empires shifted. Borders bled. And Europe, suddenly enriched and emboldened, turned inward once more, with questions not about the stars, but about salvation. The Protestant Reformation shattered the Catholic Church's monopoly on truth. Martin Luther, hammering his theses on a church door, didn't just spark religious reform. He ignited a firestorm that burned across the continent. Wars of faith. Peasants' revolts. Power shifting from popes to princes. But perhaps the most powerful revolution wasn't of religion or royalty. It was of reason. The scientific revolution rewrote our understanding of the cosmos. Copernicus said the Earth wasn't the center. Galileo dared to prove it. Newton, with a single equation, explained the heavens and the fall of an apple. Suddenly, the universe was no longer divine mystery. It was math. Ideas spread. Faster than ever before. Thanks to Gutenberg's press and a rising class of thinkers, the Enlightenment took hold. Philosophers like Locke, Voltaire, and Rousseau challenged monarchs, questioned tradition, and declared that perhaps, just perhaps, people had the right to rule themselves. And then, boom, revolution. In 1776, 13 ragtag colonies declared independence from the mightiest empire on earth. In 1789, Paris erupted with the cry, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. The American and French revolutions didn't just change governments, they changed the very idea of government. But as liberty was debated in salons, factories were rising across England. The Industrial Revolution was not just a new chapter, it was an entirely different book. Coal, steam, iron. Cities swelled. Smokestacks rose. Trains screamed across landscapes. For the first time, humans bent nature to their will on an industrial scale. But the price was steep. Children in factories. Smog-choked cities. Colonies gutted for resources. Europe didn't just industrialize itself, it industrialized conquest. The 19th century became a race, not just for progress, but for empire. Africa was carved like a cake. India became the jewel in the crown. China was humiliated, Japan awakened, America expanded. The world was now stitched together by railroads, telegraphs, steamships, and ambition. And beneath it all, tensions brewed. Empires clashed. Ideologies hardened. Nationalism flared. The fuse was lit. And what followed would shatter everything humanity had built so far. It began with a bullet. One shot fired in Sarajevo, and the world caught fire. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914 wasn't just the death of a man, it was the detonation of a century's worth of tension. Alliances, rivalries, empires, all pulled into the vortex of World War I. What was supposed to be over by Christmas became a 4-year meat grinder. Mud. Rats. Trenches stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland. Men lived and died for inches. The Industrial Revolution's gifts, machine guns, barbed wire, poison gas, were turned against their creators. By the time the guns fell silent in 1918, over 16 million were dead. And for what? The old empires, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, Russian, lay in ruins. Germany humiliated. A peace treaty, signed in Versailles, tried to seal the wounds. But it didn't. It only buried them, alive. And while Europe buried its dead, something unexpected was rising. In 1917, amid the chaos of war, revolution swept through Russia. Tsar Nicholas II abdicated. A new ideology stormed the stage: communism. Lenin promised peace, land, and bread. He delivered civil war, famine, and a dictatorship. But the seeds were planted. The Soviet Union was born, and the world would never again be so neatly divided. The 1920s danced to jazz, but the rhythm was offbeat. America boomed: cars, radios, flappers, but beneath the glitz, the economy was fragile. And in 1929, it cracked. The Great Depression wasn't just a crash, it was a global collapse. Banks failed. Unemployment soared. Desperation spread. Desperation is fertile ground for extremism. In Germany, humiliated, impoverished, and furious, a failed painter found his voice. Adolf Hitler. He didn't just promise revival, he promised vengeance. The Nazis seized power not just with fear, but with hope twisted into hate. They blamed Jews, communists, the Treaty of Versailles, anyone but themselves. And the world watched, uncertain, unwilling to believe how dark things could get. They found out in 1939. Hitler invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war. World War II began not with a bang, but a blitzkrieg, a lightning war that smashed through Europe in weeks. France fell. London burned. Millions fled, millions fought, millions died. But this time, it was a world war in the truest sense. Japan invaded China. Italy ravaged Africa. The United States, at first watching from the sidelines, was pulled in on December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor. A date that would live in infamy. Then the world turned. The Allies pushed back. The Soviet Union, at unimaginable cost, broke the Nazi war machine at Stalingrad. The United States unleashed its industrial might. D-Day. The liberation of Europe. And finally, Berlin. Hitler dead. The Reich in ashes. But the war didn't end with Germany. In the Pacific, Japan refused surrender. Cities burned. Soldiers fought to the last man. And then, Hiroshima. One bomb. Then Nagasaki. Two. The world blinked into the atomic age with a mushroom cloud. In August 1945, Japan surrendered. But the shadow of that fire still stretches across history. 75 million dead. Cities flattened. Empires dissolved. But peace? Not quite. Because the victors didn't trust each other. The Cold War wasn't cold for those caught in the middle. The United States and the Soviet Union, two superpowers, two ideologies, stared each other down with fingers on nuclear triggers. Berlin divided. Korea split. Cuba, almost the spark that ended everything. The space race took humanity beyond Earth. The arms race threatened to end it entirely. Meanwhile, colonies around the world broke their chains. India, led by Gandhi's quiet fury, gained independence from Britain in 1947. Across Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, flags changed, borders shifted, identities forged anew. But freedom wasn't always peaceful. Civil wars, coups, and puppet regimes turned independence into a different kind of battlefield. In the 1960s, the world seemed to split at the seams. Vietnam. Civil rights marches. Mao's Cultural Revolution. Prague Spring. Protests in Paris. Assassinations of leaders and dreams. The world was waking up, but in pain. And then, slowly, the temperature dropped. In 1989, people in Berlin picked up hammers, not to fight, but to break a wall. Brick by brick, the Iron Curtain crumbled. The Soviet Union, once seemingly invincible, collapsed under its own weight in 1991. The Cold War was over. And for a moment, it seemed like liberal democracy had triumphed. Globalization accelerated. The internet connected minds like never before. A kid in Nairobi could read Shakespeare. A teenager in Tokyo could start a global movement. The world felt smaller. Boundaries blurred. But peace? No. The 21st century opened with fire. On September 11, 2001, the world watched as towers fell and a new era began. The war on terror reshaped geopolitics. Afghanistan, Iraq, surveillance, fear. The United States, the sole superpower, found that empire in the modern world comes at a cost no one can afford. And while soldiers fought in deserts, another war was brewing, digital, invisible. Social media changed how we think, speak, and act. Information became weaponized. Truth became optional. Civilization, so long built on knowledge and structure, now faced chaos not from outside, but from within. And still, we endure. We explore Mars. We manipulate DNA. We carry the sum total of human knowledge in our pockets, and yet, loneliness rises. Division grows. The tools we forged to free us now bind us in algorithms. But the story isn't over. Civilization has never been a straight line. It zigs, zags, falls, and rises again. What began with fire and stone now pulses in data and code. We are the latest chapter, but not the final one. The question isn't where we've been,